Okay. So we just watched this video called Initiation to Game B, and we had some thoughts, and we thought we would record those thoughts to share back into this emerging, distributed, self-organizing ecosystem of people talking about this Game B thing. And so that's what this is going to be. I am Malcolm Ocean, for those of you who don't know me, and this is Eric Chisholm, a collaborator of mine and also my roommate at the moment. And um, yeah, so
Where do you want to start?
I think we should sort of take as an assumption maybe that people have watched the video,
Yes.
like so that we're not recapitulating stuff. And so well, we really liked the opening, right? Like it was like, oh, cool, it's
The
kind of
opening was really
Matrixy
good.
vibes, but not neither overdoing the connection to the Matrix, imagery, but nor like, yeah, it felt good, and and then yeah, I mean, video game aesthetic is a really interesting choice for exploring the idea of playing different kinds of games.
And it,
Um,
it did have that video game aesthetic, and the production value on that was quite good with, all the voice acting and the pixel graphics and the even the dialogue bits. Like the whole container, the whole aesthetic of that was very well done, I want to say.
yeah, yeah, but we felt like it got off to a weird start pretty early on with
The
uh,
Parasite was the
with the
main sort of
parasite
like,
imagery.
ugh.
Um, so yeah, so there was this image of a parasite which sort of came out of nowhere, uh, and it's such a slippery thing, but from my perspective, represents a really weird um the parasite thing represents a really weird, a really tempting metaphor to try to use to point at something, and the metaphor is not even inaccurate. It's just uh, uh sort of counterproductive.
It feels sort of game A itself,
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, you have to fight this parasite that's in you. You have to do a lot. You have to
which was
relate dualistically.
conditioned.
Yeah, right. And it's like, sure, like we are conditioned into triggered responses and so forth, but that's like, and yes, you when you are modeling on the level of memes, when you're modeling on a population level, you can talk about memes as functioning parasitically. When they're in you, they are you. You are it. It is you. It is not separate from you, attached to you, and you need to peel it off or put salt on it so it freaks out like a leech, or let it go, or it is you. It is your actual sense making of things. And the idea that it's somehow separate from you, as the parasite image evokes, is uh, I think like I used to relate to game A in such and such a way, like with this, not exactly a parasite imagery, but definitely with a kind of my judgmental patterns um are taking over or something like that. And it gave me the sense that, though, the thing I need to do is to get away from my judgmental patterns, or to let go of them, or to um, somehow win over them in some sort of fight.
Yeah, a lot of fight energy in this whole thing.
Yeah, yeah. And so, having stared at the ways of thinkingness um, of the game B puzzle for about a decade now, it's become increasingly clear to me that relating, like, framing things in terms of parasites is uh, uh yeah, just
Especially when it's about your own thinking.
counterproductive. Yeah, it's like, it's one thing to sort of model, okay, so we've got this mimetic kind of thing kind of taking over this community, right? You can kind of map out, okay, this memeplex seems to be taking over this thing. um But on an actual moment to moment level, you've got your own actual sense making of things. And all of the conditioned responses that you've learned are your defenses and coping mechanisms that are actually keeping you whatever degree of safe within game A as it exists at the moment. And even if in some sense you could simply drop them if you were in game B, you don't actually know that, and you can't even tell if you're in game B while those are active, because what you because you'll be projecting those structures onto whatever's happening around you, quite likely, even if what's happening around you isn't actually threatening you in those ways. Like, you have to engage with quite seriously the question of, can I tell that this situation is safe for me? I think we should bring in the coherence thing. um
I mean, that's pretty relevant. Yeah.
yeah. So uh so we've been looking into this framework called coherence therapy. Well, the therapy is the methodology, but
And
they
this
have,
is the latest lens on, like, there's many other things that also have a very similar sort of thread, as a similar
yeah,
vibe that I want to
pointed all
mention.
this. Yeah. But yeah, there's this emotional coherence framework which talks about memory reconsolidation and talks about the underlying emotional coherence of all behavior and so forth. And um it points at how, in order to do behavior change, you need to get in touch with whatever uh whatever part of you is actually driving whatever behavior you're doing, and you need to get in touch with the part of you to whom it makes sense to do this behavior you're doing. And now, obviously, if you're thinking about behavior change, some other part is of you, some other sense making, maybe even a wiser sense making, is saying, this doesn't make sense, I don't need to do this, this is unnecessary. But if you're still doing it, some other part of you does think it's necessary, like actually thinks that. And so there's a need to find out what the coherence is of that perspective. You know, game A is installed through a series of distinct experiences that people go through in childhood. Um, I mean, I think that people making the film know this, but they sort of they're framing that as the parasite. But again, it's not separate from you. It is your actual sense making process that is generating this thing that, on a population level, or on a external to a person level, you can talk about as a parasite. But internally, for the most part, with maybe some rare exceptions of things that, but even there, it's like, I really think these are like 1%, maybe even 1% of 1% of the stuff that you'll find is actually truly like not part of you and is completely somebody else's. Like, you might have inherited your mom's fear of whatever, not because of a specific thing that she did, but just because some fragment of her sense making got lodged in you. And you might be able to go, wait, that was never even my thought in the first place. But this is very rare. This is not the usual case. Usually you're learning by seeing how things work. And so the shift from a game A way of thinking to a game B way of thinking, in my perspective, from my perspective, as far as I can tell, involves this quality of being able to notice, oh, I'm making sense of things in this way. That made sense and was necessary in this context. And if I'm in a situation that's different than that, I can do something different. And sometimes the situation is simply, I'm an adult now, I'm not powerless. Whereas if you're unable to mentally, grow up certain parts of you, then you'll be sort of having emotional flashbacks to experiences of powerlessness that, even in a game B society, children would sometimes have. Infants would have. I want this object and I can't get it because I'm a baby and I can't explain to anybody what I need. Um, but uh, but if you have the chance to metabolize those, you can sort of, move beyond them, and you can move beyond the sort of game A strategies when that's the thing to do.
Sounds like you've been thinking about this for a while, about how we get there.
Yeah, I've got this, like, I don't know, about 8,000 words probably now um written in a document titled How We Get There, which I haven't published yet, but in part because it's not done. um
Right. I think so. A large part of what you're talking about is the framing of how we get there. The initiation video seems to be largely about, like,
how we got
it
here.
is it is important to get there,
Yeah, and
and
here's where
and
we
then
are. Just,
large.
here's
That's right.
here's the framing of the first game, and then game A and game B. um
Hmm.
and I like the bit about, like, each person having to play their own role. Like there's something cool about that. I feel like um the video sort of could have maybe walked through a bit more of like how to go about finding out what kind of role might be yours to play. Um, it it sort
I
of
mean, that is its own whole complex question.
right, which maybe the film didn't want to get into, but yeah. Um, I guess on that note, though, one of the other things we were noting was that seemed sort of weird about the video was that for all its for all its game aesthetic, it was lacking in uh any sense of interactivity. Like the pioneer sort of showed up in the scene, and it's like, okay, you have a
I
parasite
have
that's
some
about to wake up.
questions.
Yeah, it's like I have some questions. It's like, great. Well, here's our sort of our scripted introduction and overview of this whole thing, as opposed to sort of um walking through the pioneer's questions kind of organically and flowily, and or even tying back to, like, when you were asking questions, one of the questions you asked was blah 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 blah, and here's a partial answer to that. And I know part of what they were trying to say was like, it's not about the answers, it's about the question asking itself.
There were
But
a lot of answers in
there were
that
a
whole
lot of
thing.
answers in this video, right? Like they weren't pointing at some of the deep puzzles, like if you're trying to make a decision, who gets to decide? How do you decide? How do you decide how you decide? How do you decide who gets to decide? Who gets to decide who gets to decide? Why do they get to decide? Like, how does all of that need to work in order for everybody to be satisfied with the decision? Is democracy a good frame on that? Is consensus? How do you relate to expertise and
Is
natural
game B
information
asking a lot of
hierarchies?
questions?
What were you saying there?
Is game B asking a lot of questions? Is that what that's about?
Right. Is game B just about asking questions? Is like,
Uh huh.
um and
I mean, so in terms of the video game frame of the thing, um, a lot of video games these days do have kind of longer introductions, and but there's also been a lot of discussion in the best introductions in video games give you control almost immediately. And
mm,
Half-Life was Half-Life 2 in particular was famous for doing cutscenes without ever taking control away from the character. Like there's a whole cutscene going on and you interact however you want with it, pretty much.
right, you like maybe can't proceed through the scene until the cutscene ends and the
That's
door
right.
opens, but like you can wander around in the middle.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
To the
It's
extent it was video gamey, it was of the bad introduction of video games. That's what I've, as someone who's played a lot of video games, that's what I think.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, it was also weird that it was, on one level, that it was sort of video game aesthetic in the sense of being kind of 8-bit and like video game dialogue esque. But I mean, I wonder what would it have been like if each of those game, the first game, game A and game B, had actually had a mini game associated with it. What is the game A, or what is the first game? How
Mm.
do you play that game? What type of game is it? um it like, is it a game where it, like, the first game is going to involve this kind of wholeness thing, but it's not a uh, mesh network intertwingled global wholeness, it's a sort of local wholeness and whatever. And then game A is going to involve some sort of, it's like Monopoly or whatever, is like maybe a pretty good game A sort of mini game. And then for game B, you've got some sort of, collaborative puzzle web. But more interestingly, like, one of the things that really goes underspecified by a lot of people in a lot of situations. And I think some game B discourse um, has been implicated in this confusion, partaking in this confusion, is really not looking at what the transition actually looks like. Um, and people have, there was a thing that started to pop up a year or two ago about talking about transition B, as in, we don't, you don't want to say, oh yeah, it's so nice being in a game B community where blah 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 blah. It's like, no, we're in a community rallying around the flag of game B. We're not doing game B
Uh-huh.
yet. Nobody is. We have not figured
Proto
that out.
Bs
We
are
are
called Proto Bs because they're like an attempt towards that, in my
Right.
understanding.
Yeah, and that might have popped up in parallel to the transition B thing, like trying to point at, yeah, we're prototyping this thing. We're not there yet, but we're a thing aimed in
At
that
least they
direction.
got that part right, and then it's
Yeah.
like we don't know what it looks like in there. Here's an idea.
Yeah.
In the film, they did say that.
Right. Yeah,
I think that's another
that's
part of
good.
the thing is they were trying. It was very clearly like trying to actually lay out all this stuff on like technical-ish level. It would have been a different thing if it was more like an art film or something. I think like the beginning of Zeitgeist, not the first movie, but the second and third movies did have a very much an art film to them. They weren't like trying to convince you of a whole thing. It was just like aesthetic.
Right. Not just not convinced, but not even quite explain.
Yeah, yeah. It wasn't trying to explain
Yeah.
it. It was just I
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, like I listened to what was I listening to? Something. Oh, yeah. It was that couple minutes of the Stoa thing that went live after just after the premiere of this video. I just listened to the first couple minutes, and Jim was talking about like wanting to see more Game B art, um, and this film being one kind of foray into that. And I do think that's important. Like I do think we need to see a lot more of that. I'm working on some songs that kind of plug into different aspects of that. Uh, I think it would be uh, I think it would be a disservice to not consider all the various podcasts that are being recorded as a kind of art, but they are
Hmm.
a very verbal kind of art. I mean, as are my songs, but as was this video, to be frank, like to really, I think it would be quite an interesting challenge and a puzzle to make an interactive version of this thing where you actually get to play a microcosm of a first game of a game A type structure. And you can see how in the game A structure, the way it's arranged, there is no winning. There is no winning without someone else losing. Like there is actually an intrinsic zero sumness to how the game is constructed. But then you could
Something like
have
a
a
Nicky Case kind of
yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Yeah,
simulation
kind
thing.
of explorable. What is it called? Explorable explanation. Yeah,
Yeah.
but then importantly, you can't actually really easily depict the game B thing yet. I mean, maybe you can, but even if you can, it's way less important than trying to depict what the exit from the game A game into game B looks like. Like that is the puzzle because somehow you've got to build game B in game A. You don't get to like go to a blank slate and just set up a new society. Even if you thought you could do that, even if you had a place that was somehow protected from the outside world, actually going there and setting up a new society without recapitulating the old dynamics would be very difficult. Um, for a whole host of reasons.
It's not just the place; it's also the people. And
Right, which is the thing that they're calling the parasite, in this, right? Like it's you
no
do
parasites
bring.
allowed in here.
But actually, the opposite. It's like, no, we are necessarily going to bring in all our confusions, and the thing somehow has to be robust to those confusions. Like, and insofar as there are deeper truths about what we want collectively that can be accessed, that create these positive sum dynamics, that in turn create upward spirals that do outcompete the downward spiral and the vicious cycle of game A. Um, I don't remember where my sentence was going to end.
I mean, we're talking about the having to have game A as part of or game yeah game A as part of game B somehow and integrating that.
Right. There's no, oh, we'll just find the right people who have it all figured out and then we'll go off and do it. Um, you could get maybe close to that if you somehow got a pile of very enlightened people all together.
I
Although
mean, that was another
lots,
strange thing about it. There was only one pioneer. How is one pioneer supposed to do it on their own?
right, and the end of the thing says find
This
the
might
other.
be a little I don't know, a little sort of somewhat less relevant, I think.
Right.
But
No,
there's
I mean,
something
I
to
think
it.
it is. The site says Game B film, find the others, um, and find the others takes you to the Game B Mighty Networks site, which is kind of like a little social network type thing. Um, And
Doesn't quite say build your own relevance realization function for finding the others.
right.
That might be a bit much.
Well, right. So, I mean, this is part of the bootstrapping
Yes.
puzzle, right? How do you get people introductrinated um, into all of the the new concepts that they might need or want as part of things, while also remaining accessible and not getting jargony at the door.
Hmm.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean the film, I'm glad it exists. I don't think I'm going to be sending it to anybody because it with at least not without a pretty substantial caveat about the parasite metaphor just being um backwards. Like it is. I do not think we can get to game
I
B
mean,
while
I'd
we're
rather send
modeling
them.
game A thinking as a parasite. Like I think it will not work. Um
Hmm.
and as I said, I can see the temptation to think about it that way. I can still see how that makes sense on a systems level, like modeling it that way. But um, yeah,
I would much rather send them the circles maps.
right, yeah, yeah.
Anything else you want to
Well, I'm just sort of wondering if we leave that as a cliffhanger.
say?
Anyway, I will put some links in the description of this YouTube video to some articles I've written on how to think about this. That will, I think, if you read deeply into them, will show you how the parasite thing is confused. Particularly a piece I wrote called "Thinking That Rejects Other Thinking," which points at how if you create a dualistic divide between one way of thinking and another, you can end up in this trap where you're kind of defending yourself against a way of thinking, which is sort of the opposite of the kind of synthesis style thinking and win-win finding thinking that Game B needs in order to operate.